Good day to all our guests. Welcome to this webinar on democracy and human rights, common goals with diversified approaches. My name is Wang Guan. I'm a host and news anchor journalist here at China Global Television Network, part of China Media Group. It's great to see all of you here. This event is co-hosted by the Permanent Mission of China and Permanent Mission of the Russian Federation to the United Nations Office at Geneva, as well as other international organizations. So we're here today basically to talk about, two interlinked and, uniquely important subjects, democracy and human rights. What does democracy entail? And what does human rights entail? The debate gets as old as the subjects themselves. And today we're very happy to have invited a very distinguished group of diplomats and scholars to talk about this issue. To start with, I would like to invite the co-hosts of the event to give their opening remarks. To begin with, I would like to invite His Excellency Ambassador Li Song, Chargé d'Affaires of the Permanent Mission of China to the United Nations Office at Geneva. Ambassador Li, the floor is yours.
谢谢王冠。尊敬的各位大使、各位嘉宾。
Thank you, Wang Guan. Honorable Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the webinar. When I was discussing with Ambassador Gatilov, permanent representative of the Russian Federation, on the idea of organizing this webinar, both of us agreed that such discussions are long overdue, and now's the right time to do it. Common goals with diversified approaches showcase exactly what we as diplomats are doing in various domains in Geneva. Last weekend, an Irish pub on the street caught my eyes. On its billboard, it was written, "Uniting the Nations in Geneva since 1996. This tells exactly how Geneva should work as a platform where various countries can communicate with and learn from each other, seek common ground while shelving differences. The color green makes the world full of life and vigor, but no two leaves in the world are the same. Civilizations are rich and diverse, and so is democracy. Democracy is the shared value of the humanity, and human rights represent the common dream and pursuit of people across the world. Political civilizations and political institutions in various countries are deeply rooted in their own soil. They draw nourishment from their respective history, culture, and tradition, and is cultivated through exploration, practice, and improvement in the process of the country's economic and social development. Thus, diversified political systems and political civilizations are shaped in the world. Democracy is not something that could be mass-produced. It is not delivered through exactly the same institutions and forms even among the Western countries, let alone between the West and the great number of developing countries. No matter what form it takes, true democracy means people being the master of the country. This year marks the centennial of the founding of the Communist Party of China. In the past 100 years, the CPC, while uniting and leading the Chinese people, found a path that truly conforms with China's national conditions in pursuing national rejuvenation and promoting democracy and human rights. We practice whole process people's democracy in China. This effectively ensures that all the Chinese people run state affairs and social affairs, manage economic and cultural undertakings in various channels and ways according to law. In this way, we ensure that people are the true masters of the country. Recently, the 6th plenary session of the 19th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China deliberated and adopted the resolution of the Central Committee of the CPC on the major achievements and historical experience of the party over the past century. This resolution not only lets the world know where the Communist Party of China has come from, but also where the Communist Party of China will unite and lead the Chinese people to. We will build a socialist modern country in an all-round way, let the people live a better life, and contribute to world peace and development. Thank you very much.
Up next, I would like to invite His Excellency Ambassador Gennady Gatilov, Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation to the UN office at Geneva. Sir, please go ahead.
By upholding the fundamental principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity, democracy creates an enabling environment for individuals to live freely and autonomously. At the same time, we firmly believe that universally recognized human rights and freedoms should be implemented, taking into account civilizational and cultural characteristics, moral standards, and traditional values of societies. Unfortunately, the connection between democracy building and inclusiveness has been severely challenged in recent years. Certain countries are lobbying for a neoliberal interpretation of the concept of human rights, focusing on individualism and almost completely ignoring the individual's responsibility and obligations before society of the state. In practice, equating freedom with permissiveness leads to conflicts that do not contribute to the harmonious development of the individual, society, and the state. And one last thing, some countries pretending to be the bulwark of democracy still sees themselves in the period of the Cold War. To our regret, their recent initiatives aimed at further the deepening divisions between countries on the basis of their compliance with so-called democratic criteria has nothing to do with efforts to make our world a better and safer place. The concept of a rules-based order is another link in the policy which is destroying the pillars of the system based on international law and the principles of the UN Charter. In this regard, I would like to quote Dwight Eisenhower, 34th US president, who wisely said, "The world must learn to work together or finally it will not work at all." I am sure this meeting will provide an opportunity to identify from the perspective of democracy and human rights the challenges and the root causes for the current disturbing situation in international relations, the high level of divisions, disunity, and confrontation between states, and to discuss the unifying democracy and human rights agenda. And I thank you.
Let's move on to our panel discussion session. To start off, I would like to invite Dr. Eric Lee, political scientist, also trustee and chairman of the Advisory Council of Fudan University's China Institute. Dr. Lee, the floor is yours.
You know, we're having this discussion about democracy at a rather precarious moment for democracy. I look around, everyone seems to be saying democracy is in trouble. Okay, the American think tank Freedom House, which seems to define democracy for everyone, this year the Freedom House, their annual Freedom in the World report, it says the global decline in democracy has accelerated. It says that even the US democracy has declined significantly in the past decade. I read media reports that the US is organizing a gathering of the world's democracies. According to reports, that there are 108 countries and regions on the invite list. I did a quick check on these democracies and how they're doing with one of the most pressing challenges in the world today, the COVID pandemic. Now, these 108 democracies consist of 56% of the world's population, but had cumulative COVID deaths of 4.2 million, which is 82% of the world's total. The supposed target of this gathering, China, who is not invited, of course, has 1.4 billion people and 5,697 deaths. We can see why so many people are pessimistic about the state of democracy. Now, maybe it will be to your surprise, I am not so pessimistic about democracy. I am rather optimistic. I'm a businessman. I like results. How about let's measure democracy not by procedures, but by outcomes? Democracy's normative goal must be to deliver satisfaction to a vast majority of the people. What good are elections if they keep producing incompetent leaders? What good is an independent judiciary if it only protects the rich? What good is freedom of the press, or freedom of speech for that matter, if they corrode societies with divisions and dysfunction? What good is individual rights if it results in millions of avoidable deaths in a pandemic? Now, perhaps we can work on developing a set of measurements that show which countries are generating more democratic outcomes. How satisfied are most people with their country's leadership and directions? How cohesive is your society? Are people living better than before? Are people optimistic about their futures? Since we're speaking with a United Nations group, I'd like to quote recently the American scholar Anne-Marie Slaughter, who recently wrote in the New York Times that the United States should accept at least the possibility that other forms of government could be better. She further suggested, as a new measure of good government, we evaluate which countries are doing a good job at achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. What a great idea. I'd like to use this opportunity to say that it is high time that we end liberalism's monopoly on democracy and let more forms of democracy flourish. Thank you.
I would like to invite Dr. Natalia Narochnitsyava, President of the Foundation for Historic Outlook, the Chairwoman of the European Institute for Democracy and Cooperation, Doctor of Historical Sciences. Ma'am, please go ahead.
As a person who studied and wrote a lot on religious philosophical foundations of history and history of ideas, I can only refer that history teaches us that ideas about building a humanitarian heaven on earth have passed and follow the same pattern of first origin, ascent, flowering, and then decline. And as soon as the idea is abused for the purpose of obtaining political and economic gains, as soon as it becomes instrument for economic and political domination, as soon as one starts implementing double standards, it starts to degrade and turns into its opposite, what we see now. And those who propagate the idea degenerate as well. Well, allow me and forgive me for this daring, but individual authorities with this revolutionary upheaval in all values also manifest this degradation. The great liberals of the past mounted the scaffold for their ideals as Christian martyrs did, but they were ready to die for faith, motherland, honor, duty, love. All metaphysical values were higher for a real human being than flesh and earthly life. And that is the foundation of human culture in all civilization. It's just went through different forms, but the essence was like that. As far as human rights are concerned, there are several generations of human rights. The first generation originated from the French Revolution And it certainly refers to democratic organization of society. That's freedom of opinion, assembly, political views, equality, sex equality between states. So because it was a challenge to the abuse of Catholic Church and inequality of estates before court, where for the same crime people belonging to different layers of strata of society were not punished the same, etc. And it was the precondition, pre-foundation for democratic principles that now enshrined in constitutions of practically all countries in Africa, in Europe, in Canada, in Latin America, in China, in India, etc. So that means that category of form perfectly fits any society, but it doesn't require the same philosophy of life, the same views, the same values. The one who doesn't know what means mother will never understand the tears of a son at the coffin at the grave of his mother. So only people who cherish their own heritage are able, with respect and tolerance, conduct with somebody else, cherishing in the same way his values. So it's a wrong idea that we have to eliminate all national ethical system to have one and the same human ideology. It's the end of mankind.
Thank you, Natalia, for your impassioned speech. Our next speaker is His Excellency Ambassador Zamir Akram, Chair Rapporteur of the Human Rights Council Working Group on the Right to Development.
Democracy is not and should not be about holding elections from time to time, and also elections that for the most part are contested by and dominated by elites of a society. The common man, as it were, the poor, hardly have any voice. Their interests really are not taken up by the ruling elite that sit in parliaments or in legislative bodies. So democracy by itself does not ensure the protection and promotion of human rights, nor does it ensure the protection and promotion of human development across the board. For the poor and the hungry, the greater demand or the greater emphasis is on the right to food rather than on the right to expression or on the right to vote or whatever other right that may be there, which does not actually feed him or her. So these are facts which take us from the realm of democracy, human rights, to the realm of development. And it was for this reason that almost 35 years ago, the international community adopted the Declaration on the Right to Development. Now it's been 35 years, as I said, and I think next year we will observe the anniversary of the 35th anniversary. But unfortunately, despite the fact that so many years have passed, we are no closer to recognizing and implementing, enforcing the right to development as a fundamental human right. 2 years ago, I was entrusted by the Human Rights Council to draft a legally binding instrument on the right to development. And I was able to do so with the help of some very eminent legal experts who made an immense effort to put together such a draft text. My effort was to use language and principles taken from documents, from instruments, from resolutions, from various other means relating to this subject, that have already been accepted by the international community. So the idea is not to introduce anything new or anything different, but to build on what we have already agreed upon. And my hope has been that by adopting such an approach, we can eventually come to a consensual, unanimous acceptance of this legally binding instrument on the right to development. But we are not there yet. I think there's a long way to go. But I am thankful to the organizers for giving me this platform and explaining our point of view on this issue.
Our next speaker is Dr. Martin Jacques, editor, journalist, scholar, and political commentator. Dr. Jacques, the floor is yours.
If over most of the last 70 years, Western democracy has enjoyed a strong and successful history, its future, in comparison, looks clouded in uncertainty. Domestic crisis in the West is the endogenous factor in the decline of Western democracy. The exogenous factor is the rise of China. This is throwing fresh light on the performance of Western democracy. When it comes to delivery, there is no contest. Or, as Thomas Friedman, the New York Times columnist, wrote earlier this year, China can still get big things done. America, not so much. Unlike the Western democracies, which are consumed by the present, China thinks long term. Meanwhile, the Chinese example is exercising an increasing influence on the developing world, with the Washington Consensus now barely ever mentioned. In other words, there is presently a very serious contest between models of governance. The West believes that its model is universal and has long sought to impose it on others. In contrast, China believes its model is not for export, that it is distinctive to China. Although that said, the developing world is seeking to learn as many lessons as it can from it. I would draw the following conclusions about the impact of the pandemic and climate change for governance. In sharp contrast to the neoliberal era, the role of the state will become far more important. The ability of government and society to think long-term and operate and plan accordingly will become imperative. A much closer relationship between government and the people will be essential for any effective response. The discussion about democracy must be global as well as national. It is not an accident that the West thinks like it does. It does not actually have a concept of the world, only a concept of nation states. It sees the world simply as a collection of nation states. China, in contrast, does have a concept of the world that is integral to the history of Chinese civilization, namely Tianjia, or all under heaven. In the era of globalization and climate change, a concept of the world rather than just the nation state is essential. That is why the Chinese proposition for a shared destiny for mankind is fundamental to a new way of thinking about the world and democracy. Thank you very much.
I see His Excellency Mr. Juan Antonio Quintanilla, Roman. Ambassador Roman, the floor is yours.
Every state has the right to develop its own institutions and models. We have been defending this idea since several years ago, which, of course, this will need to represent the wish of the people and have to be in accordance with a particular situation, their culture, values, traditions. And that will and that model, of course, need to ensure also the development of the country and the well-being of the population. In the case of Cuba, for example, after more than 1 year and a half combating the pandemic, this Monday, last Monday, November 15, the country has entered to a new normal with the restart of the school year and the reopening of the country to tourism, visitors. The social and economic life of the country is again in a new dynamic. So we are celebrating these days that my country is reopening and trying to advance after very, very hard months combating the pandemic.
I've been to your beautiful country. It was a privilege, and I was very sorry. Many of us are very sorry for, the 50-year-old sanctions imposed on Cuba. Even former U.S. President Barack Obama, he himself admitted that the sanctions defeated the purpose. I saw the hand of Iranian ambassador, Mr. Ismaili Khamenei. Please, sir, go ahead.
For starters, I believe we need to have a recourse to the basics. And one of the basics that is relevant to this subject matter is the fundamental right of peoples to self-determination. The right to self-determination is essentially the right of peoples to determine their own destiny. It entails, in particular, the principle that nations are entitled to choose their own political status and governance system, and to decide their own form of economic, cultural, and social development. This also implies the realization of the people's right to exercise their full sovereignty vis-à-vis other sovereign nations. The concept of democracy as well as development should be seen in the light of the above basics. I think the international community needs to launch a public awareness campaign to challenge the mainstream politically correct proposition that the West is well positioned to proclaim global values and interpret them the way they deem corresponding with their selfish interests and supremacist impulses. And I think the time has come for the international community to demand accountability for the tragic consequences of coercive interferences and military interventions carried out under the name of human rights and democracy. And I thank you.
In the next episode of The Hub, we'll bring you the second half of this forum with remarks from a top China expert and a distinguished professor of political economy from Brazil. Diplomats at UN Geneva will also offer their take and insights. Stay tuned.